From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress, which is the reading promotion arm of the library. We have been around since 1977 promoting books, reading, literacy, and libraries on behalf of the Library of Congress. And we do so largely through a network of state centers for the book. There's one in each state, plus D.C. and the Virgin Islands. I had to go open up the Virgin Islands one. It was one of the toughest jobs I've had, but I enjoyed it. We also have reading promotion partners who are nonprofits who are interested in what we do and often are partners with some of the endeavors, not only across the country, but here at the Library of Congress. One of our major activities is the National Book Festival, which this year will be September 21st and 22nd. The Center for the Book is responsible for the author program and also for the wonderful Pavilion of the States, which has state center and state library people coming to talk about how books and reading are promoted in their states. Here at the Library of Congress, these Books and Beyond talks are a major staple, at least, of our noontime programming. We celebrate new books about the library, or especially from the library's collections, or connected with the library in some way, to try to make the point that a lot of the resources, not only from the Library of Congress, but from other libraries, are behind and a result of the hard work of our authors, but they result in a book. And this is a special book which we will learn more about in our program. All of the Books and Beyond talks, as are the talks at the National Book Festival, are filmed for later showing on our website for webcast publication in that sense. And the format will be a introduction of our speaker, a short talk with plenty of time for questions and answers, and a book signing following the talk. Because we are webcasting, we will be webcasting, I'd like to turn off all things electronic and remind you that in the question and answer period that if you ask a question, you run the risk or the opportunity of being part of the website broadcast of the Library of Congress. So thank you for joining us, and to get us started, I'm going to introduce Carol Johnson, one of the 4 curators of photography in our wonderful Prints and Photographs division. Let's give Carol a hand. Thanks, Carol. Welcome, Spence.
Thank you for coming today to hear Ron Coddington's presentation on African American soldiers during the Civil War. We are happy to have this presentation while we're having the Civil War anniversary, especially with the exhibition in the Jefferson Building, which will be up through January 4th, 2014. It's just been extended, so get a chance to see a new group of objects will be added to the exhibit in June. Ron has written 3 books on Civil War soldiers. This is his books celebrate the men who fought on the front lines, the men who are often lost to history. For his current book, Ron took on the challenge of finding identified portraits of African Americans who served during the Civil War. And remarkably, he was able to find more than 90 of these items in private collections and public institutions around the country. And even more exciting, he was able to research the men and find out more about their lives, what they did during the war, and if they survived, what they did after the war. One of the images in the book was from the library's manuscripts division in the Christian Fleetwood papers, and he also used other manuscript collections in his research. So I'd like to turn over the program to Ron, and let's find out more about the soldiers.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, John. I'm very happy. Thanks to all of you for being here today. My journey on this project started 5 years ago, and I had a lot of positive encouragement along the way. I also had some individuals who let me know that finding enough images to populate a book, and that is images of wartime identified African Americans, was next to impossible. I was also told that African American soldiers didn't do a lot during the Civil War. I did not believe any of those latter comments, and decided that I would find out for myself. So I thought a good way to begin today was to introduce you to one soldier that I think his story is representative of many that you'll see in the book. He describes himself as as you can see, I am a Southern man with Northern principles. His name is William Dominic Mathews. And I found some great interviews that he gave after the war. So I want to give you his story in his own words. He says, I was born on the eastern shore of Maryland. My father, Joseph Mathews, was a full-blooded African, and my mother was the half-white daughter of a Frenchman. I never went to school one day in my life, for so strict were the laws in Maryland against educating colored people that it was dangerous to be seen with a book. I left the Eastern Shore at 21 years, and going to Baltimore, shipped and followed the sea till 1854, when I returned to Baltimore, bought a vessel, and cruised the Potomac River and Chesapeake Bay, till a law was passed forbidding a colored man to be captain of a vessel. I was therefore forced to sell mine almost for nothing. So Mathews decides to leave Maryland, in his own words, to find a place freer than that state. So where he chooses to go is Kansas, and this is in 1856. And many of you who know history knows that that's quite a volatile time in that area. He says, I started for Kansas in 1856, where I found a great fight for freedom in progress. In Leavenworth, I opened a large eating house where I was visited by most of the wealthy whites of the town. While I entertained them in front of the house, my back door was always ajar for the fleeing traveler on the Underground Railroad, which had one of its terminals at my house. In connection with John Browne and other anti-slavery men, I succeeded in baffling the pursuers. With the assistance of Colonel D.R. Anthony, brother of Miss Susan B. Anthony, and other true and tried white men, I have more than once resisted the slave hunters who were backed up by the U.S. Marshals. In 1861, I gave up my white boarders and turned my house into a home for slaves. At this time, I organized a company of 100 men and stood guard night and day protecting the slaves as they came to Kansas from their masters. I also offered my services with my company of 100 men to the government to aid in the war, but was told that it was a white man's war and we were not wanted. So here's Mathews. He decides that he's going to lay back for a little while, and in 1862, laws are beginning to change. A movement towards raising African Americans is starting to pick up. It's happening in Kansas, so he tries again. This time, depending upon what source you read, he raised anywhere from 80 to 200 more men and offered them to the state government. This time they were accepted and became part of the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. Now, this particular regiment has a key place in history. In October of 1862, at a little place called Island Mound in Missouri, a group of men from the 1st Kansas are, by agreement with historians, the first organized group of African Americans soldiers that participated in a combat. And to give you, during the Civil War, and to give you a bit of context around that, 9 months later, the 54th Massachusetts goes to Fort Wagner. So these guys, many of them recruited by Mathews, are way out in front in the vanguard of the fight for freedom. So this all happens while they're waiting for Emancipation Day to occur. And everyone's nervous, is it really going to happen? As we know today, it does. And on January 1st in Fort Scott, Kansas, there's a huge jubilee. And one man describes it as a good old-fashioned celebration in the Southern style, barbecue and speech making. So while they're all eating barbecue and having cakes and coffee, there's 3 flags flying over the regiment, all made by the wives of husbands that are soldiers in the ranks. Several men come up and give speeches, and one of the ones that is recorded is given by Mathews. By this time, he's regarded as the heart and soul of the regiment, so everyone is listening to what he has to say. And he starts out by saying, "Today is a day for great rejoicing with us. The President has proclaimed freedom. The Southern Loyalists," that's him, "intend to take it. I am not surprised while I rejoice. As a thinking man, I never doubted this day would come, for I believed in God. It was a crime to hold and a sin to be a slave." We don't have enough time today to go through the whole speech, although I'd love to read it to you, but he does end on this note. He says, "Let me speak a word to my people. Now is our time to strike. Our own exertions and our own muscle must make us men. If we fight, we shall be respected." Now, for someone like Mathews, his life has been filled with setbacks wherever he went. The Eastern Shore, on the Chesapeake Bay, to Kansas, he was met time and time again with adversity. And yet, he still continues the courage and the positivity, the sense of hope that he had is something that I hope you'll remember today. And he's not alone. Other men that I researched, for example, Alexander Heritage Newton, who's pictured on the left here, he says, "I had no ill feeling for the Southern white people. Some of them had been my best friends. But this was not a personal matter, but a question of national issue, involving the welfare of millions, and my soul was on fire for the question, slavery or no slavery, to be forever settled, and that too as soon as possible." Martin Delany, who some of you may know as a ardent black nationalist. He was quite active in the 1840s and 1850s. By the time of the Civil War, he's about 50 years old, and he's eager to get into the Army. He says the war had become, a biographer, contemporary, says the war had become inseparable from his daily existence, and nothing would content him but entering the service. He cared not how, provided his admission recognized the rights of his race to do so. James Matthew Townsend had his own perspective. One of his friends shared this anecdote. At the beginning of the rebellion, he had a strong conviction that the war would result in the emancipation of his race. Stop just for a second here. Take a pause. The origins of this project really, for me, go back to 2004. So when my first book came out. My first book is a collection of images that I've been accumulating over the years. And Johns Hopkins University Press published it. And as a rookie author, my first time out, they invited me to the Baltimore Book Festival. So I went there eagerly and with pen in hand, ready to do what authors do, I guessed. And one of the first individuals to come up and pick up a book from the table began to look through the book very, very carefully. And I thought that she was going to hand me a copy and say, sign it, or whatever. Instead, she handed it back to me, and she said, you know, there are also men of color who participated in the Civil War. And before I could say anything, and there really was nothing I could say, she walked away. and even though I had explained in the introduction of the book that the collection of photographs were fairly limited for my own personal holdings, and I knew they weren't representative of all the soldiers who served, it still wasn't going to change her mind. And I vowed then and there in 2004 that someday I was going to do this book. And I don't know who she is. I'm assuming she's somewhere in Baltimore. I'm hoping she's going to show up one of these days and I can give her a big hug and thank her. So if you're out there. So there's something personally that I find in the power of being able to look at the face of an individual, to see their eyes, to see their expression, to get a sense of their posture, how they're sitting in a chair, what they're wearing, that stays with me, has stayed with me to this day. But when you take that photo and you put it next to their story to find out what their life was like before the war, what it was like during the war, and after, if they survived, what it was like for their families, then I think you have a really powerful connection that takes the great visual record and combines that with a little bit of what that person was all about. So when the center was getting started in 1977, that same year, I was out at flea markets with my parents who had the flea market bug. I caught it too. As my friends were collecting baseball cards, I started buying these little Civil War soldier photographs. Somehow I thought that was perfectly normal for a child of 14. This is George Garlick. This is the first photograph that I bought. He's a Navy man. And George could not have had his photograph taken had it not been for the work of this man, Daguerre. In 1839, building on the work of others, he invented a form of photography that takes his name, the daguerreotype. It became wildly popular. So I like to think that the Civil War generation is also the photography generation. It's this group of men, women, and children. They're the first ones to be truly exposed to photography. And you and I take this for granted today. I've got my iPhone in my pocket. I could take a picture in an instant. But for these men and women, it was something completely new. It was beyond imagination that you could have a photograph. So the idea that you could have this personal, intimate object of your loved one, your comrade, your friend, is a revelation and a revolution. So just to give you a sense, Abraham Lincoln was 30 years old in 1839 when photography came out. Frederick Douglass was 21. Clara Barton was 18. U.S. Grant was 10 or 17 years old. Your average Union soldier was 4 when photography came out, and George Armstrong Custer was 1. So Carol, you'll excuse me because I'm boiling down 20 years of the rich history of photography into one slide. What I'm attempting to do here is to expose you to some of the more popular formats of vernacular photography and give you a sense of what was happening during that time. So when the daguerreotype comes out in 1839, and it's pretty popular, stays popular up until about the Civil War, it cost roughly $2.50 to have one made. And you'll notice, I want to bring your attention to the materials. You've got the image area, which is some expensive chemicals, and then that is laid on top of plates of silver, highly polished silver, and copper that are sandwiched together. Expensive materials. So after working with that for a while, the ambrotype comes into play, and you'll notice immediately the price has gone down less than half, and you're now using cheaper materials. The very expensive silver and copper plate has been replaced with glass and then a piece of black paper or black glass beneath it, which turns the negative image into a positive. That's happening. Those are still popular during the Civil War. Also, after the ambrotype, coming into play is the tintype, which is a similar idea, only this time they've replaced the somewhat expensive glass with an iron plate. You've brought the price down again by another half. And then around the time, just coincident with the start of the Civil War, this new format, the carte de visite, comes into play. And here, you've abandoned these metal and glass plates altogether. You've replaced that with paper. Inventors have discovered the idea that you can make prints from a glass negative. And now you can get not just one copy, but a dozen copies of your photo. The first one looks as good as the last, and you can hand it out to all of your friends and family. Another revolution, another great step, and the price has now come down to about 15 cents per photo. So as the story goes, the gentleman sitting here, Disdaries, scratching his head, thinking about all the money he's making off of his off of the carte de visite. So the story goes, a nobleman, a French nobleman, walks into his studio in Paris with his visiting card, his calling card, which is this little card, and he has his name engraved on it quite nicely. And he hands it to Disdaries and says, "Hey, can you put my photograph on it?" And Disdaries says, of course. He does it, and instantly it becomes all the rage across France. Disdaries goes on to create a camera with multiple lenses so he can take a bunch of prints, and his career takes off. Meanwhile, the carte de visite spreads across Europe. You've got folks like Queen Victoria has over 100 photo albums filled with her family and all the royals of Europe. These are all housed in photo albums. According to one photo historian friend of mine, by the time it gets across the Atlantic and comes to the United States, there's one story of out in the frontier, there's a crude log cabin with primitive furniture inside, and in the crude table in the house is a stack of cartes de visite. So you get a sense of how wide and how quickly it becomes all the rage in America. So by 1863, 1864, Oliver Wendell Holmes, the noted American thinker, he says, as everybody knows, these have become the social currency, the sentimental greenbacks of civilization. They are all the rage. It got me to wondering, how many of these photographs do you think are actually out there? How many were made? And so I did some calculations. I thought, let's just take Civil War Union soldier images and figure there's roughly 2.5 million soldiers, and let's say some high percentage of them had their photograph taken, their carte de visite, before they left for war. And if you do that math, and then figure a bunch more had them made if they survived the war, I come up with about 40 million photographs. And that's, I think, probably a fair estimate. So if 10% of those survive today, you've got about 4 million that are out there. And you can go on eBay, the popular auction site, on any day, and you'll see about 50 new Civil War soldier images. And if you go on right now, there's thousands of cartes de visite and American cartes de visite and elsewhere. So I cast a wide net for images in the book, as the first one came out of Baltimore, and it's a lovely tintype of Jerry Saunders and his wife. You'll notice that the image is tinted. Many studios offered, for an additional fee, of course, that you could add color to the photograph. Sometimes there was a colorist on staff in the larger studios. Other times the photographer was the colorist. I also reached out to a number of public institutions. In one institution, I found an amazing collection that is the responsibility of the officer pictured on the left. He's Lieutenant Theodore Wright of the 108th U.S. Colored Infantry, and in 1864 he and his company were at Rock Island, Illinois, which is a prisoner of war camp for Confederates. They were guarding these men, and Lieutenant Wright marched his men into the local photographer studio, had them sit or stand for their portrait photograph, put them all into an album, and he sent them home to his mom to say, "Here's my men." That album has long deteriorated, but many of the photographs still survive. Here's an example of one. I'm showing the front and the back. I want to bring your attention to the back. Lieutenant Wright did me and other historians a great favor. On the back, he wrote the name of each soldier. He wrote their rank, their company, their regiment, and then below that, a personal note about each soldier. Sometimes it's about their personal life, how they got into the war. In this case, Jesse Hobson escaped from his slave master and was hunted through the swamps in Kentucky. I was able to verify all this information, as a matter of fact. And you'll also notice fairly prominent here is the back mark of the photographer. Another advantage of the carte de visite, now a photographer could stamp his name or her name and address on the back of the cart as an advertisement. Below that is the Internal Revenue stamp of 2 cents. The United States government in 1864, needing to look for funds to pay for the war and knowing that these images were quite popular, levied a tax. So if you were buying photographs, you paid 2 cents in addition from 1864 to 1866. So altogether, I set a goal to find 100 photographs, identified wartime men, and I gave up after 95. I was sort of tapped out at that point. And of that number, I researched and wrote and included in the book 77 other stories. 77 isn't particularly an important number, only that I had 77 in my other 2 books, so I thought I would be consistent. My research started at the National Archives. I accessed the military service records, which give you a nice bare bones overview of what the soldier's military life was all about. These are typically monthly, sometimes quarterly reports that tell you where they were, what their rank was at the time, and if something happened to them, you get a brief mention. The pension files are typically much thicker folders, and the soldier or his widow would file for them after the war. These files tend to contain a wealth of information. One of the interesting surprises for me is a number of the files that I requested had special examiners assigned to the case, because a number of these men were not able to prove the basic facts of their existence. When they were born, when they were married, the list goes on and on. So special examiners were sent out to Mississippi, to Kentucky, to other southern states to interview the plantation owners, the plantation owners that owned slaves, and others that may have known these men. And within these files, you'll find oftentimes tragic, but also very informative for those of us today, very informative information that helps you to understand what the lives of these men and women were like previous and after the war. So I want to give you a sampling of the stories that I found and give you a chance to see some of the wonderful images. Keep in mind, this is a representative sampling. There was approximately 200,000 men who served in the Army and Navy during the war, African American men who served in the Army and Navy, and you'll get a chance to see what some of them looked like and a little bit about what it was like for them during the war. We'll start with Robert Holloway. His story goes back to 1850 when he somehow managed to get from Virginia to New Mexico, and he met a young officer named Ambrose Burnside. Those of you who are not familiar with the Civil War may not know the name Burnside, but you know the play on his name, Cy Burns, for the very prominent whiskers that he had. Holloway stayed with Burnside as a valet through the 1850s up until the time of the Civil War and went with Burnside. Burnside goes to Washington with a regiment of Rhode Island troops, and they're in the first Battle of Bull Run that many of you may know ends with a dramatic Union retreat all the way back to Washington. Burnside arrives back in Washington. Holloway does not. He's among those that are captured by the Confederates. This is July of 1861, and he's sent to Richmond and made a cook in a prison. And Burnside eventually negotiates for his release, and I found 2 documents in the official records of the War of the Rebellion in which he's negotiating this release, and he finally winds up doing a trade of sorts. Robert Holloway comes back to him in return for 5 servants that belonged to Confederate officers. No one talked about the idea that those 5 men, those 5 servants that went back to the Confederate officers were in effect going back into slavery. Also going off to war in 1861 was Silas Chandler. He was sent by the mistress of the plantation in Mississippi on which he lived. He went with the gentleman on the left, Andrew Chandler, who was in the 44th Mississippi Infantry. Silas stayed with Andrew all the way through the Battle of Chickamauga. At that point, Andrew was desperately wounded in the leg, and as the family story goes, Silas was able to talk the surgeon out of amputating on Andrew's leg and got him back to Mississippi for treatment. At that time, Silas comes back to the war with Andrew's younger brother Benjamin, who enlists in a Mississippi cavalry regiment. That cavalry regiment is part of the entourage that escorts Jefferson Davis from Richmond in 1865, and Silas winds up being abandoned or let go or somehow surrendering in Washington, Georgia, shortly before Jefferson Davis is captured. Abraham Browne is one of a number of men who came from Canada. He was not born in the United States. His parents were, and they fled to Canada through the Underground Railroad. And Browne, when he found out that Massachusetts was looking for men to join the 54th, he came across the border and signed up. He also became one of the regiment's first fatalities. When Union forces began moving into the South, in this particular case, in Silas Johnson's case, when they came into the Mississippi Delta region around Vicksburg, the plantation on which Silas lived, the husband, the slave owner, was off in the Confederate Army back east, and the mistress of the house was there. She took Silas and the other slaves, and they left for other parts of the South. So the story goes, Silas accompanied her and some of the other slaves through Alabama, and at some point decided that he had some other options. One of those options was to join the Union Army. So at some point he said his goodbyes and wound up in Louisiana, where he enlisted in New Orleans. William Henry Scott knew when he was 8 years old that he was going to escape someday. He got his chance 5 years later and slipped away from the plantation that he lived on in Virginia and made it to a Union camp, which happened to be where Loring William Muzzy and the 12th Massachusetts Infantry were stationed. Muzzy took a liking to William Henry Scott. A lot of men in the regiment did, and they helped him to learn to read and write. Muzzy's mom sent books from their home in Massachusetts to help give young William an education. And Muzzy eventually moves through the ranks. He leaves the regiment. He goes to the commissary department of the Army of the Potomac. And William Henry Scott is eyewitness to some of the biggest battles of the war. He's at Gettysburg. He's in the Overland campaign with Grant, and he's at Appomattox during the final days of Lee's army. So William Henry Scott sees more of the war than most soldiers. After the war, they stay together. They go home to Massachusetts. They finally part ways. Late in life, William Henry Scott comes back to Massachusetts. The two men live pretty close to each other, and they die within a year of each other. James Monroe Trotter, his efforts to fight for equal pay and opportunities for his comrades in the 55th Massachusetts Infantry is quite well known. It is him that, at least according to a number of counts, where he's one of the first ones to stand up and lead the fight for equal pay. He says, "We will not degrade the name of an American soldier by accepting inferior pay," and by that he's referring to all soldiers, black and white. Who finally wins the day? The lack of payment. They refuse to take money. Over a year goes by before the government rectifies it. He and his family suffer a lot, but they win. Octavius McFarland joins the 62nd U.S. Colored Infantry. The leaders of the regiment are folks that have more of a bend towards abolition, and they set about the task of issuing a number of general orders to the regiment to teach the men to learn and read and write. And they have a series of contests. After they do their drilling for the day, they're learning to read and write. They have these contests to see who's the best. And Octavius wins one of those contests, and he gets a gold pen for his efforts. Sergeant William Harvey Kearney may be a soldier who doesn't require an introduction for some of you, but he is one of the men in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry who, after their colonel is shot, continues up the steep parapets of the fort and makes it all the way to the top. The storm of fire and shell is so great, he's literally forced down on a bended knee, and he's still carrying the flag. Finally, when there's not many men left and they realize that they cannot go any further, they're forced to go back down the parapet. Up until this time, he miraculously has not been wounded. On the way down, he's wounded 3 times, and he never lets go of the flag. And he says when he finally makes it to safety, "Boys, the old flag never touched the ground." And that becomes a fairly famous slogan, saying, and he tells the story many times throughout his long life. John Hines, his nickname is Jack. He tried to escape twice. The second time he was successful and joined a Pennsylvania cavalry regiment. This particular company that he was in happened to be the headquarters, attached to the headquarters of William S. Rosecrans, and at the Battle of Chickamauga, in the Stampede, when Rosecrans's headquarters had to evacuate as the Confederates were coming down on them, Hines's horse stumbled and fell. He received a very serious injury, but he managed to get away, and he also did manage to survive the war. John Peck received the first of his 2 battle wounds in Florida at Olustee Station. He had a saber blow in the head. Taylor Aldridge and his regiment were among the last to go into the Battle of the Crater. You can imagine the scene as some of his contemporaries describe it. The crater is filled with men. There's no way they're going to get in. The Confederates are shooting down, and Aldrich and his men try to go around one side of the crater to continue the attack. But the Confederate fire is so heavy that it's withering them. They cannot go any further. One shell totally decapitates a man that's in front of the regiment. The colonel stands on a large boulder that has been thrown from the explosion, the initial explosion at the crater, and orders the men back. And he's one of the lucky guys to get out without being harmed. Milton Murray Holland at Newmarket Heights, which is part of the Petersburg campaign, they're going into action against a well-entrenched Confederate forces, and a number of the white officers in the regiment are shot down, and rather than fall back, Sergeant Holland and 3 other sergeants stand up and they continue to lead the charge. They rally the men and they give it their all. A number of people witnessed the event, and afterwards he and the other 3 sergeants received the Medal of Honor for their actions. In that same battle, John Spence was wounded 3 times by artillery, and he recovered in time to participate in the capture of Fort Fisher in North Carolina. When Richmond fell, early in the morning on April 3rd of 1865, Union troops were racing to get into the city, which by that time a fire had broken out in one district, and you could see the bellowing smoke. And as that race was going on, William Wright and his regiment were coming over the hill. They saw the flames, they saw the smoke, and he, who 9 months earlier had been a slave in Kentucky, went from being on a farm to being one of the first to walk into Richmond. Also in Richmond that day was John Eliot. He and his regiment were called in to help preserve the, at that point, a very fragile peace, to protect men, women, and try to keep everybody under control while they attempted to put the fires out and bring some semblance of order and help feed everybody and begin the process of healing. Anderson, Ruff, and Abbott, another individual who came from Canada, he was a medical man trained at the University of Toronto. On April 14th, 1865, he was out celebrating and had gone home to sleep. The Confederate Army, Robert E. Lee, had surrendered. Everything was looking great. About 2 o'clock in the morning, he gets a knock on his door, and it's a messenger who has been sent from Mary Todd Lincoln. She, of course, is at the bedside of her dying husband, and she had been crying out for Elizabeth Keckley, who was her confidant. And several messengers were dispatched around Washington, and they couldn't find her. One of them got the idea, well, if we find her friend, Dr. Abbott, then maybe we'll find her. So Abbott and the messenger went out around Washington to try to find her. They were unable to do it. He went home, went back to sleep, and later that morning he was awoken by the bells that were tolling the death of the president. Now, Dr. Abbott was also a friend of President Lincoln, and he was one of the first to see his body in state in the White House. And as a token of the remembrance of their friendship, he was given a shawl that President Lincoln liked to wear on cool days. A month later, while the war is all but over after Robert E. Lee has surrendered and Richmond has fallen, out in Texas, it's still going on. George Mitchell and his regiment are out on a reconnaissance, and they're attacked by Confederates and forced to go back to where they were stationed. During that retreat, the Confederates keep coming on, and the Union rear guard is protecting the column. That rear guard is made up of Mitchell and his company, and it is to them that goes the credit for firing the last hostile shots of the Civil War. I want to end the stories with a quote, some excerpts actually, from a letter that was written by this gentleman, Charles Singer. He's a barber, a free man from Covington, Kentucky. And in September 1864, when it does not appear that President Lincoln is going to be reelected, he writes this letter in support of the president and answering the question, why should we fight for the United States government? So let me read this to you. He says, "Remember, soldiers, we're fighting a great battle for the benefit not only of the country, but for ourselves and the whole of mankind. The eyes of the world are upon us, and on the result depends our future happiness. I hope that we may never see the day that we cannot speak for the cause of freedom. Why should we not cling with courage to this government, her interests, laws, and institutions? There are many reasons for so doing. It is not merely that I am grateful for the protection and the citizenship that I may hope for, but I recognize in the stability of this government a source of strength to other nations. While this government stands, there is hope for the most abject, disabled, and helpless of mankind. Some say, show me what the colored man has to fight for, and then I will go. You cannot see it now, but wait until some future day, and it will unfold itself most gloriously to the whole country. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take your questions. Yes, ma'am.
So what was your methodology of trying to ferret out these sources, particularly once you got beyond public repositories and into private collections?
I initially started only looking for soldier images, which follows on the research that I did for my first two books. And I quickly realized that this was not going to be a good way to represent the role of African Americans in the war, keeping in mind that for the first 2.5, 3 years, they weren't legally allowed to be soldiers. So I expanded the search so I could include others that participated in the war prior to late 1862, early 1863. So you'll see some men like Robert Holloway who were servants and stayed servants, or valets, body servants. There's a number of names that were used. So I expanded my search, but I really wanted to find identified wartime images as much as I could. And as I mentioned in my comments, casting a wide net, the network of collectors and dealers that I know was my starting place, and then I went on from there. Yes, sir. There are folks like me who are collectors of images, and so a number of those images come from them. Some of the images, a small number, come from families who still possess them. But I think overall it's I'd say about half, or maybe slightly less than half, of the images in the book are from private collections and families, the other half from public institutions. Now, I should also point out that I like to think of the book as being the beginning of helping to bring these images out. And you have to remember that these were never intended for public display. These are personal, intimate family objects. So my searching, and it continues today, I'm continuing to search, and it is my hope that this book will help other images to come to light.
Yeah, one of the reasons I asked is I have a friend who's spent his life collecting these images.
Right.
So he has an extensive collection.
I would like to meet him. That would be wonderful. Yes, sir.
One of the things that surprised me about your exhibit was the number of black officers.
Mm-hmm.
The impression that I've always had, especially for movies like Glory, is that officers of U.S. colored troops were white officers.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to disavow that. I mean, contradict that.
Yeah, I think there certainly is a disproportionate number of images of officers in the book. Your impression is largely correct. The vast majority of officers in the African American regiments were white. In the case of someone like William Mathews, the number of men that he raised for the 1st Kansas, if he was a white soldier, he would have instantly been given a captain's commission and probably been eligible to be elected, which was a common practice, by the way, for officers, as even a higher rank than captain. However, when it came time for him to be mustered in, the white officer that was sent to do this, and this was only a week or two after the Emancipation Proclamation, refused to do it on the grounds of his color. So at that point, Mathews leaves the regiment with all these men that he had helped recruit, he leaves the regiment. The heart and soul leaves the regiment. And he appeals to all of his friends, both white and black, that helped him before the war to get his captain's commission, and they cannot make it happen. Flash forward to late 1864, so we've moved ahead another year and a half or 2 years, and by that time there's a little bit of change happening, and this time, or I should say, in the meantime, while he's out of the army, he's recruiting men for more. He doesn't give up. He's recruiting more men, and this time he recruits men for an artillery battery, and the laws have changed a little bit, and this time he is offered a commission as a lieutenant, and he accepts it. So the uniform that you're seeing him wear here is as an artillery lieutenant. Now there's other men like James Monroe, Trotter, who became an officer. Massachusetts, always being out in the forefront, were a bit more aggressive, but even that was problematic. The moment that the white officers in the 55th Massachusetts found out that the state was going to give him and some others commissions, the reaction was very, very bad. And Trotter calls it, he says, color phobia. I am being attacked by color phobia. But some commissions are given out. Most of them come too late in the war to be able to really be effective as combat assignments. Martin Delaney, who I showed early on, he's the highest ranking field officer, and that's a major. He's the only major. Most of the officers, and by one source it's about 120 men out of 200,000, are chaplains and surgeons.
Thank you. It's still significant.
I agree. It was definitely a revelation, and I'm also not mentioning the Louisiana Native Guards, which were organized in 1861 and 62. And there's one man in the book who was an officer in that regiment. In 1863, Nathaniel Banks, one of Lincoln's political generals, comes down to Louisiana, and he begins a systematic purge of all the African-American officers in that regiment, and by 1865, only one is left. Yes, sir?
All those images from those family collections or private collections,
Yes.
did they come from families that were more prevalent on the northeast part of the country, the southern part, or west coast?
It would, yes, definitely in the Northeast. But images for the book came from all over the country, as far south as Texas, out to Los Angeles, but primarily on the East Coast. Yeah.
Were there any particular states that yielded more pictures? In other words, were more of these pictures taken of folks in certain states than other states?
Well, the photo research seems to me to be a bit random. You have someone like Lieutenant Wright. His regiment, the 108th U.S. Colored Infantry, were in Illinois. They also were in Louisiana. They didn't see any action, yet they're probably one of the best represented regiments that I've been able to find so far. But other regiments like the 54th are fairly well represented. So there doesn't seem to be a rhyme or reason, and it's part of the reason that I enjoy doing this. You don't know where the journey is going to lead. There's no regularity. So many variables come into play. What makes one image survive from 1864 or 1865 through 150 years? They survive fire, they survive flood, they wind up being changed from, maybe there was one person who cared enough in the family to save the photographs. Just don't know, there's so many variables, and for that reason they can tend to be a bit out of balance when it comes to trying to equally represent all of the states and all of the regions of the country. Mm-hmm.
Other questions? Well, Ron, thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
I'll say a word.
Thank you all.
I just love collectors. Ron, your enthusiasm, is engaging. I also want to point out, I want to thank Carol and the Prints and Photographs Division for bringing this talk to the Center for the Book. one of the great things we are able to do is partner with divisions throughout the library and learn about their collections, and also to point out that these multimedia resources that the Library of Congress holds come from all kinds of different collections, and it's really fun to see someone who comes at it from the other side and to engage in these. And he and I spoke a little bit about the Prints and Photographs wonderful, the website, and how much of the searching was done on the web. And I can see that the world just is opening up for you because of your early childhood interest in collecting those photos. So I think it's terrific. So please join us for a book signing in the back, and you can talk to Ron a little bit more and maybe give him some more clues about some of those collections out there that'll end up in future books. So let's conclude with another round of applause.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.